Good morning. You guys never cease to amaze me. So recently I sent out a poll to my patrons and you guys on YouTube about what topics would interest you most for tutorials. And to my amazement, you all voted pretty heavily towards the topic of game design. What makes that so crazy is that game design is not only the topic I'm most skilled at, and it's not only the part I'm most qualified to really talk about, it's the aspect of game development that I love the most. And I just can't believe that you guys would be interested in the thing that I happen to care the most about.
That don't make no sense!
For those of you who are interested in other things, rest assured I'm going to keep making tutorials on a wide range of topics. As I learn how to make better videos and faster, and what you guys are interested in, I will be making more specialized tutorials for basically everything. But today, we're going to try a new format by doing a deep dive on a very special design problem. I don't want you to think of this as a tip or like a quick fix or a simple tutorial. Please think of this as like a full-blown class and discussion about game development. Get excited and allow me to introduce you to the three-player problem. So firstly, we'll need to explain what the three-player problem is. And to do so, we're going to take a look at a board game called Monopoly. We're going to use Monopoly because there's a good chance you've played it, or at the very least heard of it. But in case you haven't, Monopoly is a horrible board game where players take turns rolling dice to move around a board. As you move, you'll land on properties, and if that property is unowned, you can buy it. But if that property is owned, you'll need to pay the owner rent. And if a player needs to pay rent and can't afford to do so, they lose. The last player standing wins. Now, let's imaginize a hypothetical game of Monopoly with three players. There's going to be red player, blue player, and then the green player. The three-player problem has two variations, the 2 versus 1 scenario and the 1 over 2 scenario. In our imaginary Monopoly game, we're going to be taking a look at the 2v1 scenario first. All right, so first up is red player. I'm going to give red player an arbitrary power value out of 10 that describes how well they're doing at the game. So for red player, we're going to say that in this game of Monopoly, their power is 5 out of 10. Blue player is doing slightly better than red, but not by much. Blue player's power level is 5.5. The problem in this game is green player. Green player has actually been doing really well since the start of the game, and they're way ahead of the other two players with a power level of 7.5. The three-player problem's 2v1 scenario is this. There can only be one winner in the game of Monopoly, and both red and blue player want to win the game. However, in order to win the game, they need to defeat green player, but neither red nor blue player has the power to do so alone. So rather than struggle in isolation, red player suggests a temporary truce with blue player. They combine their power levels and they destroy green player. This is a problem because at this point, we're no longer playing a fair and balanced three-player game, which is what we all agreed to. Now we're playing a game with teams, and the teams are definitely not even. It's unfair, it feels terrible, and it's going to be a real sour spot for green player because their only crime in this game was just playing well. It gets worse though, because the three-player problem still has the 1 over 2 scenario. So let's say in our imaginary game, red and blue player do team up and they just crush green player, right? Let's look at our power levels again now that everything has been shuffled around. Red player, who was in last place, is now the leader with a whopping 8 power. Blue player, who's been a contender for red since the start of the game, they're a close second place with 7.5 player. The problem is still green player, who was doing well until they were unfairly forced into last place with an absolutely abysmal power level of 4. Now, in theory, it is possible maybe that green player could make a comeback, but if you look at the board and you look at what that might take for it to happen, it's pretty safe to say that green player has already lost. They're out, or they're not out rather, but they have no chance of victory. The three-player problem's 1 over 2 scenario is this. Green player has no way to stay relevant in the game and no meaningful path to victory. However, what green player can do is spend what little resources they have to make sure that another player loses. Since red player was the one who suggested the truce, green player destroys red player's chance at success. The cruel irony here is that green player can decide who wins the game, but they can't choose themselves. Therefore, the three-player problem and its two scenarios can be defined as this. In multiplayer games, it's a situation where one player is so strong that they become the target of all other players, or one player is so weak that they can only hinder another player's chance to win. Now, some of you may have noticed that that definition is actually a bit broad. In practice, you could, in theory, have either of those things happen in situations with more than 3 players. You could also call this the odd player problem if you wanted to. And I know of at least one designer, Wayne Schmidberger, who gave it the amusing title of the petty diplomacy problem. And I can tell you from a somewhat detached point of view that at the end of the day, this is just a kind of balance problem. It's something you need to address when you create any game with multiple players and conflicting goals. But as a general tip, design is crazy, amorphous, and situational. So you should always try to give things definite names and definitions whenever and wherever you can. I first heard about this design problem in a book called Tabletop, Analog Game Design, in Louis Pulsifer's section. They called it the three-player problem, and it's what I'm going to call it moving forward. Since I'm trying to present this as a kind of deeper talk and discussion about the three-player problem, in the same way I would try and teach a class, I really want you to pause here and take a moment to stretch, get some water, and just let everything sink in for a moment. Even rewatch that last bit if you need to. Good? Cool. So far, all we've done is introduce and define what the three-player problem is, but it's important that you can recognize the problem, because we're about to dive immediately into an example game that suffers from the three-player problem a lot, which is League of Legends. What? League of Legends?
That don't make no sense.
League of Legends isn't like Monopoly at all. There's not 3 players, there's 10, and they're balanced completely evenly down the middle into 2 teams of 5. The game has nothing to do with money. You fight monsters and other players on Summoner's Rift, guarding minions, destroying watchtowers, and inching your way closer and closer to victory as you attempt to destroy the opposing team's nexus. How in the hell does League of Legends suffer from the 3-player problem even a little bit? Great question. Let's look at the definition again. The 3-player problem is: in multiplayer games, a situation where one player is so strong they become the target of all other players, or one player is so weak that they can only hinder another player's chance to win. In League of Legends, you are correct. There are only 2 teams, and each team is made up of 5 players. However, on each team, each player has their own unique individualized level that ranges from level 1 to level 18. Let's look at the 1/2 scenario, or the situation where one player is so weak that they can only hinder another player's chance to win. I'm playing the attack damage carry in this game. Basically, it's going to be my job to be the team's offense. However, let's say I fall behind my opponent, like really behind. Remember the power levels I gave in Monopoly? It's the exact same thing here. I have already died to my opponent several times, and each time I do, they get significantly stronger and I get significantly weaker. The numbers are different, but the effect is identical. I'm only level 7 and they're level 9, and that difference feels insurmountable. As I continue to play poorly, I need to start seeking out protection from my teammates. In order to stop dying, I seek protection from my other, stronger teammates. But because everyone has definite roles in this game, and my teammate's role is definitely not to keep my ass from getting killed, I start dragging them down with me. Unlike our Monopoly example, I'm not able to drag an opponent down. That's just the nature of League of Legends. However, I am unwittingly dragging my own team down. What this means is that numerically the teams look like this. However, if I'm barely effective and I hardly count as one person, and my opponents have gotten so strong that they're able to pull the weight of multiple people, then what is the difference between this and Monopoly? Hint, there isn't one. Now, as a class, we could start to discuss how this is actually an intentional part of League of Legends design, or how the 3-player problem does or doesn't technically apply to this phenomena, but frankly, that's not a very good use of time. Learning design is about being able to abstract and think about situations differently. So if we can take our definition of the 3-player problem and apply it to a game like League of Legends, then we're doing something right. The only real goal is to have a general understanding that players who are too far behind or ahead shouldn't have total or zero control over the game's outcome, respectively. Keeping this in mind, there are a lot of games, genres, and modes where we can start to see the 3-player problem creep up. Free-for-alls, 4X games, RTSs, strategy games, asymmetrical battlefields, it's a long list. Once we can understand the problem and see it in new and interesting places, we can start to look at its deeper causes and then also ways to design around them. Which, segue, what are the things that cause the three-player problem? Another excellent question, my fine students. The answer is a lot. Remember how I said that design is about making specific definitions and titles where you can? This is the point where that starts to break down.
That don't make no sense.
Every game is so different and complex and dynamic that it would be impossible to actually list all of the things that could cause the three-player problem. However, I've taken some time to compile a list of what I personally think are some of the biggest ones. There are more, and in fact, I encourage you to think about it and try and find more. But these are the causes that we're going to be looking at today. Having large power disparities between players, letting players give or take game value without effort, ignoring players who are lacking achievable challenges, including player objectives that have limited solutions, and issuing rewards and punishments that affect too little of the game. So briefly, very briefly, what do each of these things mean? Number one, power disparities are pretty straightforward. Games that have power curves or situations where players get stronger over time will always be presented with situations where players can advance at different speeds. The problem is that things start breaking down a lot if your players can end up on opposing ends of the power curve within the same game. For number two, everything in every game has some kind of value. Even in a game like Minecraft, mining dirt has value, if not just because it requires time. The problem of what I like to call free value is that players can sometimes get a lot of value for little to no effort. And in a multiplayer game, this is especially bad if one player can just give another player massive amounts of free value. Number three, a contestable goal is some kind of objective that you have the tools to achieve. If you don't have the tools to achieve a specific goal because of power, economics, or whatever, that is a non-contestable goal. So things get bad then if your players find themselves in situations where all of their goals become non-contestable. We talked about design spaces in a previous video, link in the top right, and they'll come up often. Goals and objectives form their own sort of design space. If there's only one way to achieve a goal, and that can be fine, it also means that it becomes significantly easier for some other mechanic in your game to block off that goal. Goals which are too, quote, lock and key are at a high risk for becoming non-contestable. Lastly, talking about design spaces again, the collection of mechanics in your game form a larger design net, if you will. As this sort of web, you want to connect as many parts of it as possible. If you issue some kind of reward or even a punishment that applies to only one single, highly specific aspect of the game, you dramatically increase the chance of creating a problematic feedback loop. Woo! Oh, pause. Like literally, pause the video and collect yourself. That is a massive chunk of information. Don't rush headlong into more information without understanding how you got here. So quick recap. We are talking about the three-player problem. The three-player problem is a situation in multiplayer games where one player is so strong they become the target of all other players, or one player is so weak that they can only hinder another player's chance to win. It's caused by a number of issues, the biggest ones being having large power disparities between players, letting players give or take value without effort, ignoring players who are lacking achievable challenges, including player objectives that have limited solutions, and issuing rewards and punishments that affect too little of the game. So then, how do you design around these issues and avoid the three-player problem altogether? Get excited because I have a big ol' list of do's and don'ts and some examples to show you everything. We're going to tackle them all in order, so let's go. Number one, having large power disparities between players. Whenever you have power curves present in your game, the easiest way to make sure that things don't get too out of whack is to completely avoid using static numerical powers. This means that you don't use things like player levels or experience. Instead, do use things like skill gaps, or if you have to have levels, make it so that everything in the whole range of levels is available to every player from the start of the game. A great example of this is going to be Hunt Showdown. So in this game, every player has roughly the same degree of lethality. There are no levels. A good player with the worst gun in the game could easily defeat a bad player with the best gun in the game. In this clip here, I'm fighting a group of players who could easily defeat me. And it's not that I'm higher level than they are, or that I've got better gear. It's that I have enough experience and practice that I can outmaneuver them and exceed. And to prove it, once we take the bounty from them and try to leave and succeed in our objective, my opponents actually come back and overcome us in a moment of pressure and desperation for us. Number 2, letting players give or take game value without effort. Throwing, or the concept of throwing, has been a part of multiplayer games forever. The idea being that someone can actively not play the game and just ruin the match for everyone. When this sort of thing happens, the team that has the thrower is nigh guaranteed to lose, and the opposing team has to exert almost no effort in order to win. And that is a much bigger problem than the person throwing the match. Don't let a player who forfeits the match ensure that a different player is going to win. Do make sure that even if there was only one team in the entire game, they would still have a list of objectives and challenges that they need to face and overcome in order to secure a victory. Case in point for this one is Monopoly. An official rule of Monopoly is that you can trade or sell any amount of unimproved property you own to anyone for any amount of money. Now, obviously, it's assumed that in the spirit of the game, each player is engaging in a trade will always be trying to get as much as possible for themselves. And in the early stages of Monopoly, that is absolutely true. But after 3 hours of arguing and mindless dice rolling, the fact that I can trade another player everything I own for a single dollar just breaks the game. It's this exact reason that Monopoly is A, one of the most popular board games in the world, and B, that no one wants to play it ever. The balance of the game is just completely non-existent because the game has nigh infinite free value. Number 3, ignoring players who are lacking achievable challenges. The whole point of every game in existence, from like Go to Tag to Tetris, is to overcome challenges. It is mind-boggling how many games I come across where there's a complex system of dynamic challenges, and because of how dynamic everything is, you can get walled out of having access to contestable challenges. It's too common, guys. Don't ever let players find themselves in a place where they don't have the tools required in order to play the game. Do make sure that every challenge has a backup option or several backup options that could be completed by both the strongest and the weakest players in the game. I'm really excited for this example because it's the League of Legends game I showed you earlier. This is the same game. I was certain we were going to lose, in part because I had lost against my opponent. I actually dislike League of Legends, but as a game, I admire it because they actually have a solution for nearly every one of these problems. I lost against my opponent, and they have become my non-contestable target. However, I don't give up. At this point in the game, I dig my heels into the ground and immediately start fighting the weak monsters around the map, trying to stay as safe as possible. Eventually, by doing this for long enough, I closed the gap between my opponent and I. And in this fight, I overcame my main challenge because there was an alternative that let me catch up. Number 4, including player objectives that have limited solutions. In puzzle design, there's a system called the lock and key approach. Basically, it means that there is a single problem, the lock, and only one solution that will ever work for that one problem, the key. Now, for a number of situations, this actually works fine. Let's say there's a boss in the game, and the only way to get to the next area is to defeat the boss, and there is no alternative. The Souls games do this a lot. It's the lock and key approach. It's fine. Don't do this. Do not use a lock and key approach when designing competitive multiplayer objectives. You certainly can if you know what you're doing, and there's a specific reason for it, but otherwise avoid it like the plague. Do give players challenges that can be approached using different tactics, tools, and mechanics, which can all result in success. Ignoring the absolute dumpster fire that is the Harlequin called Overwatch 2, one of the things that made the original game so magical was the fact that it could resonate with many different players and the different ways that players wanted to interact with the game. Why? Because your objective was always something cool, like escort the payload. What does that mean? I don't know, but I know that I can do that by maybe healing my teammates or causing distractions. I can knock my opponents off point. I can assassinate characters before they even reach the objective. I can threaten areas with crowd control. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. If the goal of each Overwatch match in game was just, oh, be the first team to get 25 kills, then there would be no healers. All of the tanks would be memes, and there would be another 34 and a half damage dealers in the roster. It would be a even worse dumpster fire. Number 5, issuing rewards and punishments that affect too little of the game. This whole concept applies mostly to rewards, but in theory, you could apply it to just about anything, because feedback loops can happen fucking anywhere, man. A feedback loop is when doing thing A lets you do thing B better, and doing thing B lets you do thing A better. This whole situation becomes problematic in a competitive multiplayer scenario when you say, okay, for defeating your opponent, we're going to give you money. Okay, what do I use the money for? Can I maybe change my appearance? Do I get abilities that alter the game state? Can I radically morph the battlefield? Can I impact the rules of the game itself? No. I get money and the only thing I can do is defeat my opponent more better again. Okay, I guess I'll do that. Don't introduce a reward or a punishment that only lets you get more of that reward or punishment. Do give rewards and punishments that actively affect as many different parts and mechanics of your game as possible. Since we took a look at some of the League of Legends, or some of the things that League of Legends does right, I thought it would be cool to also look at some of the stuff that Heroes of the Storm does right. So in-game, it's very similar to how League of Legends works, and you still earn experience. But unlike League, where you earn experience for only yourself, in Heroes of the Storm, you actually earn experience for your entire team. And you do earn experience from everything you do. So in this way, it means that my personal rewards affect nearly everything on a massive scale, even if I can only do so a little bit at a time. And it also means if that for some reason I play poorly and I don't do well, then I'm not left behind. If I'm playing badly, I can still at least participate in objectives with my team because I will always be at least as strong as they are. Oh man, okay. Final review of everything we've discussed today. The three-player problem is a situation in multiplayer games where one player is so strong that they become the target of all other players, or one player is so weak that they can only hinder another player's chance to win. It's caused by a number of issues, the biggest ones being number 1, having large power disparities between players, number 2, letting players give or take game value without effort, number 3, ignoring players who are lacking achievable challenges, number 4, including player objectives that have limited solutions. And number 5, issuing rewards and punishments that affect too little of the game. So in order for us to design around these issues and generally avoid the 3-player problem, we can, number 1, don't use number-based power curves, things such as levels, and do use skill gaps and consistent tool sets. Number 2, don't let a player that forfeits ensure victory for a different player, and do require a minimum amount of effort to achieve objectives. Number 3, don't let players exist without manageable challenges, and do offer alternative achievable challenges at all stages of the game. Number 4, don't use the lock and key method of creating goals, and do provide challenges that can be approached in many different ways. Number 5, don't include outcomes to events that only affect one part of your game. Do disperse rewards and punishments across the whole design space of your game. And that's it. Oh boy. Take some time to just let all of that sink in. Design is weird, man. It's complex. It applies to a bunch of stuff unless it doesn't. And the solution to every problem is just kind of to do something. There is no wrong or right in the world of design. There is only better and worse, sometimes both. Trying to teach something like this, or even harder, trying to learn something like this, isn't something you do all at once right away. It takes time. But being exposed to it, thinking about it, and trying to apply it whenever and wherever you can is how you get better. It's how you make better games in the long haul. If people knew more about design, we wouldn't end up with all the broken games that feel bad. Anywho, this was a hell of a lot to talk about today. Please let me know how you feel about the longer videos. I want to do them more, but I don't really know if I can manage it time-wise, which is all the more reason to bring up Patreon, because every person who embarks with this on this adventure with me as an adventurer not only gets access to builds of the game and other assets and stuff I'm working on and extra goodies I make along the way, it really, really affords me the time to make videos like this. Big shout out to the adventurers who have already signed up. I again, appreciate you guys so much. I'm going to have to say that every time because I mean it. This would not have been possible without you. Otherwise, this channel is the place to stay tuned for all my future videos, and there's links below for things that might tickle your fancy. I've got to get back to work. I've spent way too long on this. I will see you all next week.
That don't make no sense.